The investigation had transformed into something far worse than a simple legal inquiry. Every day, Ji-hoon was summoned before different committees and subjected to new tests, designed to prove that humans were lesser beings, unworthy of bonding with Volanti nobility. They tested his psychic potential and found nothing, because humans had no psychic abilities whatsoever. And the investigators treated this absence as evidence of inferiority rather than simply difference. They tested his historical knowledge, asking him obscure questions about Volanti, dynasties, and galactic treaties that he could not possibly have learned in the few months since humanity first encountered other species, when he pointed out that this was obviously unfair. One of the noble investigators smiled coldly and said that any being worthy of marrying into the imperial family should possess such knowledge. Regardless of their origin, Ji-hoon did not rise to the bait. Instead, he asked a question of his own. When your species first achieved spaceflight, he said calmly, did the older civilizations demand that you know their entire history before treating you as equals? The investigator had no answer. They tested his physical abilities in a series of trials that seemed designed to either humiliate him or kill him. But they had clearly underestimated what it meant to come from a death world. The Volanti lived on a planet with mild seasons, gentle gravity, and an atmosphere perfectly suited to their biology, while Earth was a place of extremes where survival required constant adaptation and struggle. When they made Ji-hoon run until exhaustion, he outlasted 3 Volanti athletes who collapsed before he even began to tire. When they tested his pain tolerance, he endured stimuli that made the medical observers wince and look away. When they placed him in an environmental chamber that slowly reduced oxygen levels, he remained conscious long after they expected him to pass out, his body drawing on reserves that evolution had granted to a species born in a world that constantly tried to kill them after each trial. Whispers spread through the court. The human was strange, they said, and perhaps humans were more dangerous than anyone had realized. Princess Yaren watched all of this through the surveillance systems that monitored the investigation chambers, and with each passing day, her admiration for this impossible man grew deeper. He was fighting for her, she realized, and fighting in ways that no one had ever fought before. He was not trying to prove that he was better than the Volanti, or that humans deserved special treatment, but rather he was simply refusing to accept that he was less, and in doing so, he was forcing everyone to confront their assumptions about what made a being worthy of respect. On the 5th day of the investigation, someone tried to kill him. Ji-hoon had grown accustomed to the bland Volanti food served in his quarters, nutrient-efficient meals designed for species that did not particularly enjoy eating, and so he did not notice anything unusual about his dinner until he took the first bite and felt a burning sensation spread through his mouth and throat. He recognized the feeling immediately because the United Earth Navy trained all its officers in biological warfare recognition. Poison. He forced himself to vomit immediately, expelling most of the contaminated food before it could fully enter his system. But enough had already been absorbed to make his vision blur and his hands shake uncontrollably. His communicator was on the table, across the room, too far to reach in his weakened state, and he collapsed against the wall, struggling to remain conscious. Then his door burst open, and 2 servants rushed in carrying medical equipment. "The princess sent us," one of them gasped, already preparing an antidote injection. "She sensed something wrong through your partial bond and demanded we check on you immediately." Ji-hoon was too weak to respond, but he filed that information away for later. Yaren had sensed something through their bond, which meant the preliminary ceremony had created some connection between them. However faint, the antidote worked quickly, and within an hour, Ji-hoon was able to stand again, though his body still felt like it had been hollowed out and filled with sand. Emperor Kasvora arrived personally to investigate. His face dark with fury as his security officers examined the poisoned food. This was a targeted assassination attempt using a compound specifically designed to kill humans. The security chief reported, "Only a handful of people in the palace have access to such substances. Find them," the emperor commanded, his voice cold as deep space. "And when you do, bring them to me." The investigation revealed what Dowan had already suspected. A faction of conservative nobles had been secretly working with Tharn agents, passing information and resources back and forth, in an effort to prevent the marriage alliance when confronted with evidence of their treachery. 3 noble houses immediately denounced the conspirators and pledged their loyalty to the emperor, while 2 others attempted to flee and were captured before they could reach the spaceport. The Tharn ambassador was expelled from the Dominion, with a formal declaration that his government's interference in internal affairs would not be forgotten, but the damage had been done. Word of the assassination attempt spread throughout the galactic networks, and suddenly the story of the human who dared to marry the cursed princess became something much larger than a simple diplomatic arrangement. Other species began watching closely, curious about what would happen next. Some admired Jihon's courage, while others thought him foolish. And still others wondered what it said about humanity that one of their kind would risk death for a chance at connection with someone everyone else had abandoned. The investigation committee, shaken by the scandal of conspiracy within their own ranks, announced that they had seen enough. The full bonding ritual would proceed as Commander Ji-hoon had requested if he survived. The marriage would be recognized as valid under Volanthi law if he did not survive. Well, at least the matter would be settled. The night before the ceremony, Ji-hoon finally received permission to see Yaren one last time. She was waiting for him in her garden, standing beside the pool of glowing fish, her silver skin pale in the artificial starlight. "You almost died because of me," she said without turning around. "You almost died because you wanted to help someone you barely know. I know you better than you think," Ji-hoon replied, walking to stand beside her. "I know that you pretend not to care what others think of you, but you care deeply. And I know that you have spent your entire life building walls to protect yourself from rejection. And I know that you are terrified right now, not of the ceremony, but of what happens if it succeeds." Yaren finally turned to face him, and he saw tears glistening in all 4 of her eyes. "If this works," she whispered, "if we truly bond, then you will be stuck with me forever. And I do not understand why anyone would choose that." Ji-hoon reached out and took her hand, feeling the cool smoothness of her skin against his palm. "On Earth," he said, "we have a tradition that when 2 people marry, they make promises to each other. And one of those promises is to stay together through good times and bad times, through sickness and health, until death." He squeezed her hand gently. "I am making that promise now," he said, "not because of politics or alliances or proving anything to anyone, but because I have spent the past weeks getting to know you. And I have decided that I want to spend the rest of my life continuing to know you." Yaren stared at him as if he had spoken in a language she could not understand. "You are insane," she finally said. "Probably." Ji-hoon agreed, "But I am also right here, and I am not going anywhere. So tomorrow we will stand in that temple, and we will complete this ceremony. And then we will spend the rest of our lives figuring out what comes next." He smiled at her. Together, Yaren said nothing, but she did not let go of his hand. They stood there in the garden for a long time, 2 people from different worlds, watching the artificial stars spin overhead and wondering what the future would bring. Tomorrow would change everything, and neither of them could wait to see what happened next. The Grand Temple was the oldest structure in the Volanthi Dominion, built thousands of years ago when the species first developed their psychic abilities and needed a place to practice the sacred rituals. that would define their civilization. Its walls were carved from living crystal that resonated with mental energy, and its ceiling soared so high that clouds sometimes formed among the ancient pillars. Today, every seat was filled. Representatives from 100 noble houses occupied the lower galleries, while diplomats from dozens of alien species crowded the observation platforms above, and billions more watched through broadcast systems that carried the ceremony to every corner of the galaxy. The Tharn fleet waited at the edge of Volanthi space, ready to invade if the marriage failed and the alliance collapsed. Commander Park Ji-hoon walked through the temple doors wearing the ceremonial robes of a bonding candidate, white fabric that seemed to glow against his dark hair and brown skin. He was the first human to ever set foot in this sacred place, and he could feel the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders with every step. Princess Yeren waited for him on the central platform, dressed in silver that matched her skin, her 4 eyes fixed on him with immense intensity that made his heart pound. She had never looked more beautiful or more terrified. The high priest raised his ancient hands and the temple fell silent. We gather today to witness a bonding unprecedented in our history, he intoned, his voice echoing through the vast chamber. A union between Volanthi and human, between Princess Yeren Kasvora and Commander Park Ji-hoon of Earth. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but no one dared interrupt. The full bonding ritual requires complete openness between both participants. The high priest continued. The princess must lower all barriers and extend her full psychic presence, holding nothing back, and the candidate must accept this presence into themselves completely. He turned to look directly at Ji-hoon. Previous candidates have failed because Princess Yeren's unique psychic signature is corrosive to Volanthi minds, he said. This human claims to be immune, but the full ritual is far more intense than the preliminary test he survived. The high priest paused. Commander Ji-hoon, do you understand that you may not survive this ceremony? I understand, Ji-hoon replied, his voice steady. Princess Yeren, do you accept this candidate knowing the harm you may cause him? Yeren's voice trembled, but she answered clearly, I accept. Then let the bonding begin. The temple's crystal walls began to hum as ancient machinery activated systems that had been dormant for decades, and the air itself seemed to thicken with psychic energy. Yeren closed all 4 of her eyes and began to lower her mental barriers one by one. To the Volanthi observers, it felt like watching someone open a door to a furnace. Yeren's psychic presence flooded outward, filling the temple with a pressure that made even the most shielded minds recoil in discomfort. And several observers in the lower galleries had to be escorted out when they began showing signs of distress. But Yeren was not finished. The preliminary ceremony had only required a touch of her power, and now she was unleashing everything. 2 centuries of pain and loneliness and desperate hope pouring out of her in waves that crashed against Ji-hoon like a tsunami. He felt it all. He felt her isolation as a child when other children ran away crying after trying to play with her. And he felt her despair as a young woman when suitor after suitor collapsed at her feet. And he felt her resignation as the decades passed, as she accepted that she would always be alone. He felt her fear when she first met him in the garden, and her confusion when he did not run, and her fragile hope when he proposed a solution no one else had ever considered. He felt everything she was and everything she had ever been. And it was overwhelming and terrifying and beautiful all at once. The pressure built and built until Ji-hoon thought his skull might crack from the force of it. And somewhere in the distance, he heard shouting as observers demanded that the ceremony be stopped. But he did not stop. Instead, he did the only thing a human could do when faced with a wall of psychic energy that he could not possibly reciprocate. He spoke. My name is Park Ji-hoon, he said, his voice cutting through the psychic storm. I was born in a small city called Bizon on a peninsula in the eastern part of Earth. Yaren's eyes snapped open, all four of them staring at him in shock. My mother was a teacher, and my father was a fisherman, Ji-hoon continued, his words coming faster now. I have two older sisters who used to torment me when I was young, and I joined the Navy because I wanted to see the stars. The pressure was still building, but Ji-hoon kept talking. I have been afraid every day since I arrived at this palace, he admitted. Afraid that I was not good enough, afraid that I would fail, afraid that I would let you down. Tears were streaming down Yaren's face, but the ritual was still active, her psychic presence still flooding through him. But I am more afraid of leaving you alone, Ji-hoon said. I am more afraid of going back to Earth and spending the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I had been brave enough to stay. He reached out and took her hands in his. I cannot send you my thoughts the way your people do, he said. But I can tell you with my words that I choose you, and I will keep choosing you every day for as long as I live. The pressure reached its peak, and for one terrible moment, Ji-hoon felt like he was standing at the center of a star, surrounded by impossible heat and light. Then it was over. The psychic energy dissipated like morning fog, and Ji-hoon remained standing exactly where he had been, unharmed and unbroken, and still holding Yaren's hands. The temple erupted into chaos. Some observers were weeping, while others were shouting in disbelief. And the high priest was staring at the two of them with an expression of utter astonishment. The bond is complete, he finally announced, his voice shaking. The marriage is valid. Emperor Kasvora rose from his throne, and slowly the temple fell silent. Let it be known throughout the Dominion and beyond, he declared, that Princess Yaren Kasvora is now wed to Commander Park Ji-hoon of Earth, and that an alliance between our peoples is hereby sealed. He looked at the broadcast cameras that were carrying this moment to billions of viewers across the galaxy. Let it also be known that any threat to the Volanti Dominion is now a threat to Earth, and any threat to Earth is a threat to us. So those who would do harm to either should consider carefully before proceeding. At the edge of Volanti space, the Tharn fleet received new orders and began its withdrawal. The ultimatum was quietly forgotten in the weeks that followed. Scientists and scholars from across the galaxy studied what had happened and debated its meaning. The simple explanation was straightforward enough. Humans lacked psychic architecture, so there was nothing for Yaren's corrosive signature to damage, making them uniquely suited to bond with someone that no other species could safely touch. But the deeper meaning was harder to quantify. Humans were supposedly primitive, a young species from a dangerous world who had only recently stumbled into the galactic community. And yet one of them had accomplished what countless noble Volanti had failed to do. One of them had seen past the fear and the superstition, and the centuries of failure to find the person hiding underneath. One of them had chosen connection over safety and love over self-preservation. Perhaps some observers suggested that was what made humans special, not their technology or their politics or their military strength, but their stubborn refusal to accept that some things were impossible, and their reckless willingness to try anyway. In her garden, now their garden, Yaren sat beside the glowing pool and watched her husband attempt to feed the bioluminescent fish. He was doing it wrong. Of course, scattering the food too widely instead of placing it precisely where the fish preferred. But she did not correct him because she enjoyed watching him learn. Do you regret it? She asked. The same question she had asked him so many times before. Ji-hoon looked up at her and smiled, and she felt a warm pulse through the bond they now shared. Not words or thoughts, but something deeper. A constant presence that reminded her she was no longer alone. I told you once that where I come from, people do not marry for political advantage, he said. They marry because they choose to. He stood and walked over to sit beside her, taking her hand in his. I chose you, he said, and I will keep choosing you. Yaren leaned against him, feeling the strange warmth of his human body and the steady rhythm of his single heart. For 200 years, she had believed that she would spend her life alone, unloved and untouched. A curse upon her family and her people, and then a lost human wandered into her garden and looked at her without fear. "I love you," she said. The words strange and unfamiliar on her tongue. Ji-hoon squeezed her hand. "I know," he replied. "I love you too." Above them, the artificial stars spun slowly through their eternal dance. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, the galaxy continued on its way. But in this small garden, two people from different worlds sat together in comfortable silence, bound by a connection that no one had believed possible. And for the first time in 200 years, Princess Yaren laughed. Every noble house in the Volanti Dominion had sent representatives to witness what many were calling either the most important ceremony in modern history or the most absurd spectacle ever attempted. Ambassador Thrall of the Tharn Confederacy occupied a position of honor in the front row, his reptilian features arranged in an expression of barely concealed amusement as he watched the preparations. He had come to watch a human die, and the thought clearly pleased him. Commander Park Ji-hoon stood in the center of the ceremonial chamber, wearing the traditional white robes that bonding candidates were required to wear. And he tried not to think about how many previous candidates had been carried out of this room on stretchers. Princess Yaren stood across from him on the raised platform, her silver skin seeming to glow under the sacred lights, her 4 eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his chest tight. She was terrified, he realized, and not for herself. Citizens of the Dominion, Emperor Kasvora announced from his throne at the edge of the chamber. "We gather today to witness a preliminary bonding ceremony between Princess Yaren Kasvora and Commander Park Ji-hoon of Earth." Whispers rippled through the crowd, and Ji-hoon heard snippets of conversation about human primitives, about death wishes, about the foolishness of allowing such a thing to proceed. He ignored them all and kept his eyes on Yaren. "This test will determine whether a human can withstand the princess's unique psychic signature," the Emperor continued, his voice heavy with exhaustion and something that might have been desperation. "If Commander Ji-hoon survives unharmed, formal negotiations for a marriage alliance will proceed." More whispers, and somewhere in the crowd, someone laughed. The high priest stepped forward, an ancient Volanti whose body was more machine than flesh at this point, kept alive through centuries of technological augmentation. "Let the ceremony begin," he intoned. "Princess Yaren, extend your presence." Yaren closed all 4 of her eyes, and Ji-hoon saw her hands trembling at her sides. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen, and he felt it. It started as a warmth at the edges of his mind, a gentle pressure that reminded him of standing in front of a fire on a cold winter night. But the warmth quickly intensified, building and building until it felt like standing inside the fire itself. The Volanti in the audience gasped, and some cried out. And Ji-hoon understood that they could sense what Yaren was doing, could feel the echoes of her psychic presence washing over them, even through the temple's protective barriers to them. It must have felt like standing at the edge of an abyss. But to Ji-hoon, it felt like nothing more than pressure, like diving deep underwater or climbing to the top of a tall mountain. Uncomfortable but bearable, strange but not harmful. He kept his eyes open and watched Yaren, watched the tears streaming down her silver cheeks as she unleashed the full force of her corrosive psychic signature against him. And he felt nothing break. "I am still here," he said, his voice echoing through the silent chamber. "I am not going anywhere." Yaren's eyes snapped open, all 4 of them wide with shock and something that looked almost like hope. The pressure faded as she pulled her presence back, and Ji-hoon remained standing exactly where he had been, unharmed and smiling. The temple erupted into chaos. Noble houses shouted at each other across the chamber, some demanding that the test be invalidated, others insisting that it proved humans were not truly sentient beings. and still others calling. For the marriage to proceed immediately, Ambassador Threll rose from his seat, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "This proves nothing," he declared. "Humans lack psychic presence entirely, which means they cannot form a true bond according to galactic law. So this union would be invalid and any alliance based upon it would be meaningless." Several Volanti nobles voiced their agreement, and even some who had seemed supportive now looked uncertain. The Thawne Confederacy does not recognize humans as full sentients under the Galactic Covenant, Thrall continued, and therefore any marriage between a human and a member of a proper species cannot be legally binding. Emperor Kasvora raised his hand for silence, and slowly the chamber quieted. Ambassador Thrall raises a legitimate legal question, the Emperor said, his voice careful and measured. "Therefore, I am ordering a full investigation into the validity of human Volanti bonding, and until this matter is resolved, both Princess Yurin and Commander Ji-hoon will be confined to separate quarters." Ji-hoon started to protest, but a gentle touch on his arm stopped him. Lieutenant Chun had somehow appeared beside him, her face grim. "Do not make a scene, sir," she whispered. "We knew this would not be easy." Guards escorted Ji-hoon back to the diplomatic quarters, where he was politely but firmly informed that he could not leave until the investigation concluded. He spent the rest of the day staring out his window at the alien sky, wondering if he had made a terrible mistake. That night, someone knocked on his door. He opened it to find a young Volanti male standing in the corridor, looking nervous and glancing over his shoulder as if afraid of being seen. "Commander Ji-hoon," the visitor said, "I am Prince Dowan, Princess Yurin's younger brother, and I need to warn you about something." Ji-hoon stepped aside to let the prince enter. Dowan was smaller than most Volanti, still young by their standards, with the same silver skin as his sister, but with only 2 eyes instead of 4. "My sister believes you survived the ceremony because you are immune to her abilities," Dowan said, keeping his voice low. "But there are those in the court who cannot accept that explanation because it would mean admitting that humans are something special." "What are you saying?" "I am saying that powerful people want this marriage to fail," Dowan replied. "The conservative noble houses see any alliance with humans as beneath our dignity, and the Tharn have agents throughout the palace working to ensure their ultimatum succeeds." Ji-hoon felt a chill run down his spine. "You think they will try to sabotage the investigation?" "I think they will try to kill you," Dowan said flatly. "If you die before the investigation concludes, the marriage question becomes irrelevant, and everything returns to the way it was before you arrived." "Why are you telling me this?" Ji-hoon asked. "What do you gain from helping me?" Dowan was quiet for a moment, his 2 eyes fixed on something only he could see. "My sister has been alone for her entire life," he finally said. "Everyone fears her, including me, but I have watched her these past weeks since you arrived, and for the first time in my memory, she seems almost happy." He met Ji-hoon's gaze directly. "I do not know if you truly care for her or if this is just politics for you," Dowan continued. "But she cares for you, and if there is even a small chance that you could give her the life she deserves, then I will do whatever I can to help make that happen." After Dowan left, Ji-hoon sat in the darkness of his quarters for a long time, thinking about what the young prince had said. He had proposed this marriage for strategic reasons, to secure an alliance and prove human worth in the galactic community. But somewhere along the way, his motivations had changed when he thought about Yaren now. He did not think about politics or alliances. He thought about the way she laughed when he told her stories about Earth, about the way her 4 eyes lit up when she explained the history of her people, about the loneliness that never quite left her face, even when she smiled. He thought about what it would mean to spend his life with someone like her, and he realized that the answer no longer frightened him. The next morning, Ji-hoon requested a meeting with the investigation committee, and when they refused, he requested again and again until they finally agreed, just to make him stop. "Gentlemen," he said, standing before the assembled nobles and priests and legal scholars. I understand that you question whether humans can form a true bond with Volanthi. So I propose a simple solution. He paused, making sure every eye in the room was on him. Let Princess Yurin and me attempt the full bonding ritual, he said. Not the preliminary touch we already completed, but the entire ceremony witnessed by the highest authorities in your civilization. The committee erupted into arguments, but Ji-hoon simply waited until they quieted. If I survive, he continued, then no one can question the validity of our bond, and if I do not survive, then you will have your answer anyway. He looked around the room at the skeptical faces watching him. Either way, he said, this matter will be resolved. The committee debated for 3 days before finally agreeing to his proposal. The full bonding ritual would take place in 1 week, and everything would be decided then. Commander Park Ji-hoon was thoroughly and completely lost. The Volanthi Palace was enormous beyond anything he had experienced on Earth, with corridors that seemed to shift and change when he was not looking, and what should have been a simple walk to the library had turned into an hour-long expedition through increasingly unfamiliar hallways. His translator implant was no help because the Volanthi apparently did not believe in signs or maps, relying instead on their psychic abilities to navigate and communicate directions. Humans had no such abilities, and so Ji-hoon wandered. He pushed through what looked like an ordinary door and found himself standing in a garden unlike anything he had ever seen. Plants with silver leaves grew beside pools of glowing water, and flowers that sang soft melodies swayed in an artificial breeze, while above him the ceiling displayed a perfect recreation of a nebula, purple and gold clouds swirling in an eternal dance, and in the center of this impossible beauty sat a woman with silver skin and 4 eyes the color of deep space. Watching him with an expression he could not read, "You should not be here," she said, her voice carrying a musical quality that his translator struggled to fully capture. Ji-hoon bowed in the formal Volanthi style he had learned from the diplomatic briefings. "I apologize for intruding," he said. "I was looking for the library and became lost. So if you could point me in the right direction, I will leave you in peace." The woman tilted her head, studying him with all 4 of her eyes. "You are the human," she said, and it was not a question. "The one from the Death World, Commander Park Ji-hoon of Earth?" "Yes," he confirmed. "And you must be Princess Yurin, unless there is another silver woman living in a hidden garden." Something flickered across her face at her name, something that might have been surprise or pain. "You know who I am," she said. "Then you know you should be running, because everyone else does." Ji-hoon looked around the garden, noting the faint hum of machinery built into the walls. Psychic dampeners, he observed. "This whole space is designed to contain your abilities, is it not?" Now she definitely looked surprised. "You understand our technology," she said. "I understand enough to know that you built yourself a cage so you could have one place where you cannot hurt anyone." Ji-hoon replied, sitting down on a bench near the pond. "It must be lonely." For a long moment, Yurin said nothing, and Ji-hoon thought he might have offended her. But then she spoke in a voice so quiet he barely heard it. "No one has ever said that to me before." "Said what?" "That it must be lonely," she said. "People say I am dangerous or cursed or monstrous, but no one ever thinks about what it feels like to be those things." Ji-hoon shrugged. "Where I come from, we have a saying that the person wearing the shoe knows where it pinches. And I figure being feared by everyone you meet has to pinch quite a lot." Yurin stood and walked closer to him, stopping a few feet away as if testing whether he would flinch. He did not. "Why are you not afraid of me?" she asked. "Should I be? Everyone else is. I am not everyone else," Ji-hoon said simply. "And from what I understand, your condition affects psychic beings, and humans have no psychic abilities whatsoever. So unless you are planning to hit me with something, I think I am probably safe." Yurin went very still. "What did you say?" "Humans are not psychic." Ji-hoon repeated. We communicate with words and facial expressions and body language, but we cannot read minds or share thoughts, and we certainly cannot be damaged by psychic abilities we do not possess. No one has ever tested that, Yeren whispered. Everyone assumed it would not matter. Well, I am testing it right now, Ji-hoon said with a slight smile. And so far I feel perfectly fine. Before either of them could say more, Ji-hoon's communicator buzzed with an urgent message from Lieutenant Chung, informing him that the diplomatic reception was starting in 1 hour and he needed to return immediately. He stood and bowed again to Yeren. I should go before my people send a search party, he said, but this is a beautiful garden and I enjoyed talking with you. So perhaps I could visit again sometime. Yeren watched him leave with an expression of utter confusion on her face, as if he had spoken in a language she could not understand. 3 weeks passed, and the political situation grew worse. The Thawing Confederacy had confirmed their ultimatum, demanding a marriage alliance or territorial concessions within 60 days, and the Emperor had no options left. His advisors whispered constantly about removing Yeren from public life, hiding her away in some distant temple where she could not remind everyone of the Empire's weakness. Ji-hoon continued his diplomatic work, meeting with various Volanti officials and making slow progress on the trade agreement. But he also kept visiting Yeren's garden whenever he could find the time. They talked about their respective worlds, about history and art and philosophy, and Ji-hoon found himself looking forward to these conversations more than anything else in his day. Yeren was brilliant and funny and sad in equal measure, and he could not understand how everyone else seemed to miss the person hiding behind the curse. One evening, as they sat watching the artificial stars slowly spin overhead, Ji-hoon made a decision. I have a proposal, he said, and I need you to hear me out before you reject it. Yeren raised an eyebrow. That is an ominous beginning. Your father needs a marriage alliance to save the Empire. Ji-hoon said, you are unable to marry any Volanti because of your condition, but I am not Volanti, and if I am immune to your psychic abilities, then theoretically, the bonding ritual should not harm me. Yeren went completely still, all four of her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his heart pound. You cannot be serious. I am entirely serious. Ji-hoon said, a marriage between us would create an alliance between the Volanti Dominion and Earth, which would make the Tharn think twice about their demands. And it would also prove that you are not cursed or monstrous, but simply different. You do not know that you would survive. Yeren said, her voice shaking. No one has ever tested the ritual on a human, and if you are wrong, I will destroy your mind just like I destroyed all the others. Then let us test it. Ji-hoon said, not the full ritual, just a small touch. Enough to see if your abilities affect me. Why would you risk this? Yeren demanded. We have known each other for only a few weeks, and you barely know anything about me. Ji-hoon reached out and took her hand, feeling her flinch at the contact. I know enough, he said. I know that you are kind and intelligent and desperately lonely, and I know that you deserve better than a life spent hiding in a beautiful cage. So let me do this, and let us see what happens. The next day, Ji-hoon stood before Emperor Kazvora and made his proposal. The court erupted into chaos, with nobles shouting about tradition and heresy and the impossibility of a human bonding with Volanti royalty. But the Emperor, desperate and out of options, agreed to allow a preliminary test. If Ji-hoon survived the initial mind touch, negotiations could proceed that night. Yeren sent a message to Ji-hoon through a servant, asking him to meet her in the garden one last time before the ceremony. I cannot guarantee your safety, she said when he arrived, her voice barely above a whisper. Ji-hoon smiled at her. I have survived things you cannot imagine, and I am still here. Why are you doing this? She asked again. Tell me the truth. Ji-hoon was quiet for a moment before he answered. Because the first time I saw you sitting in this garden, "I thought you looked like the loneliest person in the entire universe," he said, "and I decided that if I could do something to change that, I would." Yaren had no response to that, but for the first time in 200 years, she allowed herself to feel something that might have been hope. The screaming echoed through the great hall of the Volanti Palace as another suitor fell to his knees. Clutching his head in agony, Princess Yaren Kasvora stood motionless on the ceremonial platform, her silver skin catching the light of 1,000 floating crystals, her 4 eyes betraying nothing as the young noble writhed on the marble floor beneath her. This was the 9th time palace healers rushed forward, their robes flowing behind them as they lifted Lord Tevan of House Mora onto a floating stretcher and carried him away, his screams fading into whimpers as they disappeared through the golden doors. Emperor Kasvora rose from his throne, his massive form casting a shadow across half the hall as he raised his hands in a gesture of apology toward the visiting delegation. "House Mora, the imperial family offers its deepest regrets," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion and something that might have been shame. "The princess did not intend harm, and we will of course provide the finest medical care for young Lord Tevan." The head of House Mora, a thin Volanthi woman with rage burning in her 3 remaining eyes, stepped forward and pointed at Yaren with a trembling finger. "Your daughter is a monster," she spat. "A curse upon your bloodline, and everyone in this galaxy knows it. So do not expect House Mora to forget this insult." The delegation stormed out, their footsteps thundering against the ancient stone, and silence fell over the great hall like a burial shroud. Yaren finally moved, stepping down from the platform with perfect grace, her ceremonial gown trailing behind her like liquid starlight. And she walked past her father without looking at him, past the whispering courtiers, past the guards who flinched away from her presence, until she reached the small door that led to her private quarters. No one tried to stop her because no one ever did. In the 200 years since her birth, Princess Yaren had learned that people preferred her absence to her company, and she had learned to prefer solitude to the fear she saw in every face around her. She was born wrong. That was the simple truth that defined her existence from the moment the royal physicians first examined her as an infant and discovered the mutation in her psychic signature, a corruption that turned her natural mental emanations into something destructive and hungry among the Volanthi. The mind touch was everything, serving as the foundation of their society, their relationships, their very identity as a species. And from birth, they learned to share thoughts, emotions, and memories with those around them, weaving connections that lasted lifetimes. But Yaren could not weave because she could only destroy. Her psychic presence was like acid to other Volanthi minds, burning through mental barriers, scarring neural pathways, and leaving permanent damage in its wake. And no healer had ever found a cure. No priest had ever lifted what many called her curse. She was the Hollow Princess, feared by her own people, pitied by some, hated by others, and loved by no one. Marriage among Volanthi nobility required the bonding ritual, a deep psychic connection that united 2 minds in partnership. And without it, no union was valid, no alliance could be sealed, and no children could be properly raised. 9 suitors had tried to bond with Yaren over the past century, each one from a powerful house seeking the prestige of marrying the emperor's eldest daughter. And 9 suitors had failed, leaving the ritual chamber with damaged minds and broken spirits. Word had spread across the galaxy, and now no one came forward anymore. No house offered their sons, and no alliance could be built on the foundation of her marriage. Yaren entered her private garden, the one place in the entire palace where she could exist without fear of hurting anyone. Its walls lined with psychic dampeners that contained her corrosive presence and allowed her a measure of peace. She sat beside the small pond she had cultivated herself, watching the bioluminescent fish swim in lazy circles, their soft glow reflecting off the water in patterns that almost looked like the mind webs she would never be able to form. This was her life, she thought, and this was all it would ever be far across the palace, in the diplomatic wing reserve for visiting delegations. Commander Park Ji-hoon of the United Earth Navy stood at his window and watched the commotion below as the House Mora delegation departed in obvious fury. What happened? He asked his aide, a young lieutenant named Chun, who had a talent for gathering information. Another failed bonding ceremony, Chun replied, scrolling through her datapad. The Emperor's daughter, Princess Yeren, apparently has some kind of condition that makes her incompatible with the marriage rituals. And this was the 9th suitor she has accidentally injured. Ji-hoon frowned, turning away from the window to face the small quarters that served as humanity's embassy on this alien world. Humans were new to galactic politics, having made first contact only 50 years ago, and they were still considered primitive by most species, useful only for their strategic location and their surprising resilience in hostile environments. The Volanti had invited a human delegation as a gesture of openness. Ji-hoon knew they were really just curious about the strange creatures from the death world called Earth. What kind of condition? He asked. Chun shrugged. The Volanti are psychic, sir. And apparently, the princess has some mutation that makes her psychic presence harmful to others. So no one can complete the bonding ritual with her without getting their brains scrambled. Ji-hoon filed that information away and returned to preparing for tomorrow's formal reception, where he would present Earth's proposal for a trade agreement to the Emperor. He did not know then that this moment would change his life forever. That night, in the Emperor's private chambers, a very different conversation took place behind closed doors. The Thorn Confederacy has issued an ultimatum, General Voss reported, his scarred face grim in the dim light. They demand either a marriage alliance with a major house or the cession of 3 border systems. And we have 60 days to respond. Emperor Kasvora slumped in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 800 years. And we have no viable candidates, he said. Yeren cannot bond. Sana is promised to House Chenra. And Dowan is too young. The advisors exchanged glances. And finally one of them spoke the words no one wanted to say, "Perhaps, Your Majesty. Princess Yeren should be quietly removed from the succession entirely," Advisor Hin suggested, his voice carefully neutral. If she were to retire to the outer temples, the stigma on your house might lessen, and future alliances might become more possible. The Emperor said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. Outside the door, hidden in the shadows of the corridor, Princess Yeren listened to her father's advisors discuss how to dispose of her like an inconvenient piece of furniture. She had known she was unwanted, but hearing it spoken so plainly still cut deeper than she expected. She turned and walked away, her footsteps silent on the ancient stone, her 4 eyes dry because she had stopped crying about her fate a very long time ago. Tomorrow would bring another day of isolation and another day of being the princess no one wanted. And the day after would bring the same. Nothing would ever change for Yeren Kasvora, or so she believed until a lost human wandered into her garden and looked at her without fear.